You are traveling through another dimension. A dimension of confusion, banality, and shattered expectations. A journey awarded to you by a small red pill. Your next stop, the Mgtow zone.
Hello. I want to now talk to you about men's roles in society as it is understood by Islam. But remember what I said before in my previous videos. Religion and culture are infidelic lovers, neither one wanting their partners to know what is actually going on behind closed doors and drawn curtains. It's a blurred line, my friends. So I'll explain through the holy book of Muslims, called the Quran, that and nothing else. This will be my primary source. Now, you the listener may find contradictions to what I say, especially if you speak to so-called scholars of Islam, or you might even Google Wikipedia. But that doesn't really matter. Just know that what I tell you comes directly from the holiest book, according to Muslims, the Al-Quran. This is not the Sunu Rasulullah. This is from the book Quran alone. This is not from the teachings within the Hadith, which represent Muhammad as the sole decipher of God's word to the rest of humanity. Now, if you don't understand, that's okay. Those that are Muslim may better know what I'm talking about. Now, I've had subscribers ask me to give my opinions about marriage and divorce and etc. based on Sharia law. But to be honest, that's almost impossible. Sharia law is not some set in stone Islamic rule that every Muslim all over the world believes they must follow. Sharia law depends a lot on what culture you come from and which sect of Islam you choose to follow. Much like the laws for Presbyterians is not the same for Roman Catholics. In other words, the Pope's law does not fit nicely within the traditions of every Christian belief worldwide. So don't fall for the media-driven Sharia law domination of the world bullshit. That's a boogeyman, just like Al-Qaeda and turban-wearing, plane-flying terrorists. So what I'll mention is what the majority of Muslims consider their source of law, the Quran. So quit being scared about the Sharia law boogeyman
and pay attention.
Now, I'll first tell you of a story when I first became a Muslim through marriage in Indonesia. Since my Islamic, now ex-wife, refused to teach me about the religion under the foolish guise that as a woman she had no right to do so, I ended up joining a group called Ahlu Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which was a group of people that believed they could better represent the will of God on earth by following exactly how the Prophet Muhammad had lived his life 1400 years ago. To them, true understanding came through mimicry. Yes, they believed that the evolution of reason lay in the imitation of a 1400-year-old tribal custom. To give some of you a better perspective, imagine if today's Christians thought that to be a better Christian, they must don the robes of Jesus, grow long beards, and brush their teeth with a stick. Yeah, that is what it is like, and it is alive and well within the Muslim mindset today. But it is not the opinion of the majority of Muslims. Much like nailing yourself to a cross to become closer to Jesus is not the opinion of most Christians, although some people in the Philippines might disagree with that. It's obvious that this makes no sense, but after I had joined this group, it did give me a wonderful insight into how the modern Muslim thinks. One day, while I was with this Wal Jama'ah group, one member had voiced that he wanted to marry or get married. The rest of the group decided to set him up with a woman, both were from Indonesia, so that he could fulfill his wish. We escorted this gentleman to a house somewhere in South Jakarta, and once we had arrived, all us men were forced to sit in a small room outside of the house while the bride-to-be was questioned by others. During this time, us men sipped tea and smoked clove cigarettes in a small side room which was basically fit for a dog. We huddled around having small talk while this bride-to-be sat in the luxury of a wide living room equipped with sofas and TVs, talking to so-called judiciaries of Islam as they supposedly interrogated her. During this time, the bride-to-be was allowed to know every detail about her groom in waiting, including what he looked like, how much money he earned, where he and his family were from, and many other nuances about his value to her. However, my friend, the blushing groom-to-be, was not even allowed to see her face or speak a single word to her, let alone know anything about her history. Now, does this sound pathetic to you? Because it is. But this is commonplace in many Muslim countries and cultures around the world. Alright, to make a long story short, we men, huddled in a kennel, pathetically watched as the bride-to-be's silhouette marched out of the house and into the car awaiting her, obviously having given her response of, "No, I will not marry this man." Now, to bring more light to this personal story, I recall an article I recently came across on the internet, which mentioned how a Saudi man divorced his new bride after he saw her face for the first time. In other words, he had never had the privilege of seeing her asset, her beauty, before the knot was tied. And after seeing she wasn't what he invested in, well, he gave her the boot. And good for him. She obviously knew everything he was worth before it all happened. I say good on you, man. And I find it amusing how the story made headlines on every feminist webpage known to mankind and the internet, with them crying patriarchy and unfairness to women. I'll link the article below. But besides that, let me continue on with my topic. Now, what better way to start off the next chapter of this series than by looking closer at the two verses in Quran titled Al-Imran and Al-Nisa. The first meaning the family and the second meaning women. These are the third and fourth chapters respectively. These are also two of the longest chapters in the entire book. Yes, that's right. The chapter titled Women is one of the longest in the book with 176 verses, and there's no opposite equivalent. In other words, there is no chapter in Quran dedicated to men and men alone. Now, you can argue among yourselves why you think that may be. However, religions, as they appear today, take on a very gynocentric role. Consider that the entire structure of Christianity is built on the chaste womb of Mary and who she birthed, namely Jesus. In Catholicism, its whole purpose, it seems, is the worship of God's so-called mother. Now, we can also consider verses in the holy text, and in this case in the Quran, such as Al-Imran verse 6, which states,
Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 6. He is the one who designs you in the wombs as he pleases. There is no God but he, the noble, the wise.
These types of verses with a gynocentric focus are many throughout the Quran and other holy texts. Now, another example of this appears only 8 verses later, which states,
Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 14. It has been adorned for people to love the desire of women. Buildings, ornaments made from gold and silver, trained horses, the livestock, and fields. These are the enjoyment of the world, and with God is the best place of return.
Now, I will relay an interesting explanation of that previous verse from a great English translation of Quran titled The Quran, a Reformist's Translation. I'll post links to this translation and its author below. It states,
The topic of the previous verse is the fighting armies, which were almost all male. The people in verse 314 refers to adult males who are expected to draft for military service. Verse 314 gives a list of weaknesses in the minds of the drafted male population to join the military for defending their community. A short-term preoccupation with those blessings, ironically, could be the cause of long-term destruction and deprivation from all.
yes, the previous verse to the one I just mentioned, 313, states this,
There was a sign for you in the two groups that met. One was fighting in the cause of God, and the other was ingrate. They thus saw them as twice their number with their eyes. God supports with his victory whomever he wills. And this is a lesson for those with a vision.
In other words, here we have a mention of not only how men are the ones drafted to fight and die in wars, but how doing so for the sake of a woman is wrong and could lead to long-term destruction. Those fighting for the wrong cause, such as the attention of a woman, white knights, will see their enemies' numbers doubled, most likely out of a sick internal realization that what they are doing defies all logic and common sense, and naturally, they'll make mistakes. Gynocentrism is a real thing. The patriarchy? No, it's not. I am of the group that believes religions taught gynocentrism, but did not advocate it as something to live and die for, but rather as something to be aware of and to use to better structure the workings of our lives and the way the world can function fairly. Again, I say that the line between religion and culture has today been blurred, and there are parties in power who understand and manipulate this. Today, religion has been co-opted by those that would have the revealings of gynocentrism become the call and mantra of religion. In other words, today religion is under the control of gynocentric madmen and women, and it is not oppressive to women, but rather oppressive to any community who chooses not to make the vagina the focus of how the world must evolve. Modern religions hide behind their gynocentric motives by blaming men. For example, women must wear the burqa, but in doing so, men can never see the woman's virtue of her beauty and reproductivity to make a fair assumption of whether or not she is a worthy female to marry and reproduce with, while he is exposed to her at all times. And this list goes on and on. Please, listeners, beware their deception. Now, what I just mentioned was from Al-Imran, the 3rd chapter. So let us move on to Al-Nisa, or Women in English, chapter 4. The first thing I want to point out is that it is in this chapter that polygamy or polygyny is first mentioned in Quran. That is one man with multiple wives. Now, I've already made a series of short videos on this subject, and I'll provide a link below for anyone curious about watching them. But for now, I'll summarize. Basically, multiple wives is considered acceptable in Quran, but for very sound reasons and under strict protocol. First of all, because at the time and for the geographical area, many men had short lifespans. Medical technology was not as advanced, but more importantly, it was men who not only often worked as merchants, traveling in caravans over long distances in harsh desert environments, but also it was solely men who fought in many of the petty tribal wars that plagued the area at the time. In short, it was not uncommon for many women to end up widowed with children.
Sorry, son, Dad died while trying to sell salt to the Persians. Or, sorry, daughter, Dad died while fighting off the invaders from the nearest tribe, trying to steal our salt that we wanted to sell to the Persians.
It was this condition that laid the foundation for polygyny. In the Quran, it states this in Al-Nisa chapters 2 and 3.
Give the orphans their money. Do not replace the good with the bad, and do not consume their money to your money, for truly it is a great sin. If you fear that you cannot be just to fatherless orphans, then marry those whom you see fit from the women, 2 and 3 and 4. But if you fear you will not be fair, then only one, or whom you already have contract with, so that you do not commit injustice and suffer hardship.
This was clearly a call on all men to, in modern times, man up and take on a widow as a second, third, or fourth wife, with the sole purpose of not allowing children to grow up without a father. This, of course, could also be accomplished through charity, but actually marrying a widow gave a man more responsibility and more of a stake in the raising of the fatherless child. Again, we can see that this is clearly a command on men to protect women and children. This is indeed gynocentric. However, though it be gynocentric, this call and the men answering helped alleviate a social problem that would inevitably cause discourse for any society. Clearly, this religion is telling men that their role in the life of a child is so important that taking on the burden of having more than one wife is a small sacrifice when considering what the contrast might bring for his community. Keep in mind how in modern times, the mere thought of polygyny, a man with multiple wives, is considered a brutal and unfair design of the patriarchy, when in fact it is the exact opposite. It is and always has been for the benefits of the woman and the children in any given community at the sacrifice of a man's life and his own convenience. Yeah, suck on that, feminists. Now, to close this episode, I will recite the rest of the verses in this section of Al-Nisa from verse 4 to 6, and they state,
Give the women their property willingly, and if they remit any of it to you of their own will, then you may take it with good feelings. Do not give the immature ones your money, which God has entrusted to you. Spend on them from it and clothe them, and speak to them nicely. Test the orphans until they reach the age of marriage. Then if you determine in them sound judgment, then give them their wealth, and do not deliberately consume it wastefully or quickly before they grow up. Whoever is rich, then let him not claim anything, and if he is poor, then let him consume only properly. If you give to them their wealth, then make a witness for them, and God is enough for reckoning.
Here it states that any widow you marry, give them their property, and don't take it from them unjustly. But then it states, do not give the immature ones your money, which God has entrusted to you. In fact, rather than give them your money, spend that money on your own and give them gifts and sustenance from that. Do you see how far divorced this is from modern principles, where a man's worth, which he has earned through his blood, sweat, and tears, can become the sole property of a woman that he contracted an agreement with to protect and nurture? How the amount of money a man himself earns is often forced to be given up to the woman by the state without even knowing how that money is spent, aka child support and alimony. This is the modern times. It makes you start to try and define in your own mind how exactly a mature woman might be understood in the grand scheme of things. Here it is even telling us that despite the fact that a man may give up some of his freedom to take on a second wife, being a widow, that under no circumstances should the man frivolously spend his wealth on her if she be immature or irresponsible. This concept is absolutely foreign in the minds of the out-of-control gynocentric women, the feminists, or the white knight manginas, not to mention the states and countries that feed off of this injustice. The final verse gives testimony to how men are responsible for the education of the wealth of all the minors that he takes on within such polygynous unions, and this also includes monogamous relationships as well. Again, the man, even after he stretches his limits by taking on the responsibility of more wives and children, not his own, must also shoulder the responsibility of regulating the wealth of all those under his care, especially in regards to how much money the man in question has at his disposal. As it stated before, whoever is rich, then let him not claim anything, and if he is poor, then let him consume only properly. Yes, my brothers, religion is gynocentric in its origins, but only in that it makes certain that gynocentrism is a design of nature and evolution, and something that must be governed properly. And the best way this can be achieved is by putting that governance back into the hands of the men who shoulder the entire responsibility of such a pragmatic circumstance. Men always will take on these responsibilities as long as they are not criticized and punished for doing so, which is happening now in the modern world with no help from the current paradigm of gynocentric worshipping religions. You know, these religions that remain a far cry from their original dictates. In today's world, the nature of men to be providers and protectors, a role which they instinctively embrace with joy, has been co-opted and humiliated by out-of-control gynocentric dictators in many forms, not just religion. And the last ism that's come along is feminism. Yes, that is the ism that is currently taking on the leading role of humiliating men out of doing what they do best. Well, thank you for listening. That is the end of this episode of Mgtow versus Islam. I hope you enjoyed it. Please stay tuned and join me for the next episode coming as soon as possible. Thank you again, and good night.